Good evening, dear friends. Good evening, good night. Today, I would really like to share something with you. My The purpose of this discussion is to offer a deeply personal and subjective perspective on various complex and controversial elements of the notorious and widely publicized legal case involving Jeffrey Epstein. Of course, as always, I will reveal exactly those aspects that are not touched upon at all by bloggers and journalists. I will look at this situation as an analyst. I will now explain in detail how various other professional analysts see this particular matter, so that you can eventually form your own personal impression of this complex situation. This will be done more or less professionally, though I certainly wouldn't use the specific word correctly in this context. A comprehensive and detailed overview of the Jeffrey Epstein legal case and investigation. The situation with Epstein, as is already clear to everyone, is not an isolated criminal case. Jeffrey Epstein is a global system. A person cannot, even if they have 10, 20, 40 assistants, companies, back offices, official offices, staff, and security, penetrate so deeply into government systems unless there are very serious intelligence agencies behind them, agencies capable of operating at that level, including in the territories of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Norway, and most importantly, the United States. It doesn't work any other way. And this is the most interesting and crucial thing about this case. Of course, this is a systemic failure of the elite institutions of the West. But what level of failure are we talking about? The strikes were delivered precisely against those target groups, as indicated by the published documents, against whom they were supposed to be delivered. To understand even more about this case, it is necessary to carefully examine who appeared in these files, which forces they belong to, and who benefits from delivering a partial, incomplete blow against them. If we conduct a simple analysis of the published documents, as well as the information about these publications, we will see that, first of all, before publication, there are several pools through which many decisions have been made over the years about what to publish just in case and what not to publish. This is very serious. What should never be published and how what is published will affect future journalistic investigations or any others. That is precisely why the public received only very limited information, which has its own objectives, had specific goals, and will have lasting effects. At the same time, no one is going to expose the network and the opportunities that the work, if you can call it that, of Jeffrey Epstein revealed. In the interests of someone. We have seen that powerful and elite Western institutions and complex systems of global governance are not just influenced but actually manipulated and fundamentally controlled through notorious and influential figures such as Jeffrey Epstein. Accordingly, this is much more profitable than waging wars. It is much more advantageous than buying weapons to achieve one's goals in this way. In fact, if we talk specifically about the criminal aspect, then everything is simple there. Crimes have been committed from the perspective of any ordinary person and society as a whole. Terrible crimes. But these crimes are committed in a huge number of countries, including right now as we are having this broadcast, and they will never be uncovered. And here it is obvious that much was done not so much under pressure, but rather consciously by society. The level of crime is quite high. The facts here are simple and most clear. This is a matter of many years. We're talking about decades of sexual exploitation of minors. This involves organized logistics, flights and island residences, security. This includes providing security, information cover, and cover from law enforcement agencies. Cover from intelligence services as well. In other words, this is not the work of a single person. It involves, of course, intermediaries, reporters, and security personnel. These are proven testimonies from the victims. Well, we know that. We live in a world where millions can be destroyed and no one will be held accountable. And right now, everything I'm listing, these are facts established by the court. These are not rumors. These are not conspiracy theories. This is the everyday reality of the planet, Earth. But here, it's important to pay attention to the level of cover-up involved. In these catastrophic crimes, the most important thing is the level of cover-up. This is exactly where the essence lies, dear friends. It's not about the fact that Einstein couldn't have acted alone. Of course, he didn't act alone. The question is, which organizations, global systems, including state ones, were behind him? Who created the conditions for him? Who gave him this money? Although he was a decent analyst. An analyst. But someone gave him that money, someone gave him the opportunity to spend it properly, someone organized the communications, the channels of interaction, the centers of shared interests. Every such house where the elite gathered was a center for the interaction of interests. It's important to understand this. So it's not about what many people say that he didn't act alone, implying that he worked with a maid and 2 assistants. That's just ridiculous. This person managed to avoid real punishment for decades, which is actually normal. There are plenty of such practices in every country without exception. He received inexplicably lenient plea deals from the prosecution. There can't be any surprises here either. He had contacts with politicians, intelligence agencies, and financiers, with academic and media elites as well. But the way it worked, it didn't function as the successful activity of a genius. It worked as a system, precisely as a system. In a similar way, I'm going to switch the audio now because I think it's hard to hear clearly. That's all. So, it worked as a system, dear friends, and a system within a state that has been operating for so many decades cannot be a commercial system. It can only be a state system. Whose and how? Well, for that we need new information. Let's put it that way. Therefore, the conclusion is quite simple. It's a matter of logic. He had not only protection, but also the organization of the system. And the talk that he was protected by certain politicians, well, that's not serious. And of course, his death. That's the point of no return. And what is the official version? Suicide. Under what circumstances? With cameras turned off, no supervision, even though he was essentially the #1 criminal, violations of all protocols, and with all the evidence disappearing. This is a classic special operation. So, from both a legal and logical standpoint, all of this is untenable. And if you set emotions aside, in fact, this isn't an investigation, it's a cleanup of risks. That's how it works. And we look at this as analysts. Why weren't the files, Epstein's files, shown in full? Why didn't that happen? Well, because publishing them in full would, first of all, undermine all the efforts that someone invested in order to achieve a certain result. Compromising materials aren't created to be exposed, but to be used for leverage and control. That's one reason. Second, because it would lead to the collapse of the reputation of the current elites. Just imagine you have ministers, prime ministers, presidents who are completely under your control. You tell him, destroy your country, and he starts doing it. But if you publish everything in full, then news will break out and you'll have to deal with the consequences. In other words, it's not profitable. Criminal cases would be opened against the people shaping policy if everything were published. And of course, it would be a crisis of trust in institutions, not only in Western countries, but in dozens of countries around the world. That's the point. That's why it's very logical that the people solving this problem, and it's a serious problem, chose the lesser harm. So it's not the truth, but managed oblivion. And from an analytical point of view, that's a very high quality and correct decision. From a moral standpoint, of course not. But who is guided by morality in politics or geopolitics? It's not even funny. The most unpleasant conclusion for people, and all conclusions for the public, are always unpleasant. What this story shows is that the elites are not equal before the law when the risk is systemic. But when have the elites ever been equal before the law? Never, of course. That all talk about values for people ends and stops where self-preservation begins and when those values can harm you. So it's not some kind of conspiracy, it's just the usual logic of closed corporations, power, and intelligence agencies. There's nothing there. And Jeffrey Epstein is just a reason. Oh, is that what you say? No. Jeffrey Epstein is not the reason, he's a symptom. Hundreds of Epsteins of similar caliber have worked and are working now. The most successful and necessary among them will never be exposed if they fulfill their function. Well, and how can you? Cases like this aren't created to be fully exposed, not at all in principle. So, what have journalists uncovered? What have journalists managed to dig up? Well, not even the tip of the iceberg. Well, the flight logs, yes, they dug those up. The passenger lists of the Lolita Express. You remember Nabokov's work. What has been revealed? Well, the flight logs of Epstein's private jet have been published. Dozens of flights, or actually to be precise, hundreds. Not just adults, politicians, billionaires, scientists, members of royal families. So what's important to understand here is this. Having a name on the list does not equal proven guilt. Well, the repeated flights, the overlap with victims' testimonies, the flights to the private island. These raise, for some, let's call it society, legitimate questions that still remain unanswered. There's also Epstein's secret deal with the prosecution in 2008, 18 years ago. This is an expose on a state scale. That is, Epstein, after committing global crimes, received minimal punishment, the right to leave prison for work, in other words, to be outside prison, and immunity for possible accomplices. That's the most interesting part. Who are these possible accomplices? We can only guess. They are concealed by the agreement. The investigation documents showed that there was constant pressure from above. Well, of course there was. And if there hadn't been this pressure, well, everything would have turned out differently. The fact that the best, the highest ranking lawyers were working on this case. The fact that the justice system was operating under constant systematic sabotage. There you have it. That's why the victim's testimony is under oath. Friends, this is a rather weak aspect. Yes, it exists. From 2019 to 2024, thousands of pages were declassified. Sexual exploitation of girls aged 13 to 17 was confirmed. There was systematic recruitment, participation of guests at these parties, with certain names recurring. But some testimonies match in their details. Despite years of no contact between the victims, this still does not make it possible to accuse anyone of specific crimes. Only what leads to this kind of result has been published. There is the role of Ghislaine Maxwell. This is a fact. She was convicted by a US federal court. This was revealed during the trial. She didn't just help Jeffrey Epstein, she was in charge. She selected the victims and coordinated the logistics. But that's a different question. Every lawyer would ask, why weren't there new charges after her conviction? But that's a rhetorical question. In fact, there are financial channels and, as I already mentioned, unexplained wealth. Completely inexplicable to anyone. How it was formed, why it was formed, what was going on. Offshore structures, who was covering for them, transfers with no economic sense, charitable foundations that don't actually operate, sources of money. In other words, no one has explained this and no one ever will. That's how things are, my friends. Sorry, it's my allergies acting up again. Yesterday it was a cold, today it's allergies. Basically, I was running around in the cold, so now I have to use medicine just to do the broadcast. So the same can be said about how this person left. Basically in the same way. And most importantly, there isn't and won't be any big list. In other words, the key revelation isn't the names, it's their absence. That is, despite the proven network, despite the convicted coordinator, despite dozens of witnesses, not a single high-ranking client has been convicted. And that is the main outcome of the Epstein case. That's all there is to say about it. We'll comment further when something worthwhile comes up. For now, it's just huge information bombs that target certain people. That's how things stand for today. So, friends, that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you. See you next time.